You're listening to Front Row with Samira Ahmed.
Musical streams of joy, enchanted rivers come alive. The gleaming joyful beats employed are here to help you to survive. Let the music cover you with street white stuff that is so good. To the rhythm, do be true and make love in your neighborhood.
Benjamin Zephaniah, performance poet, musician, novelist, playwright and actor, in many ways needs no introduction. As one of Britain's best-known and loved poets, his work has long been on the school curriculum. He's a familiar face on television, not least in Peaky Blinders, set in his home city of Birmingham. But his journey to national literary figure and professor of poetry and creative writing at Brunel University has been a remarkable one. There was the relentless racism he faced in childhood in the 1960s. There was violence within his family and repeatedly from the police. Zephaniah was involved in crime as a young man, but he knew from an early age that he wanted to be a poet, and he found his voice in a fusion of dub-style improvisation and West Indian music, pioneering live performance poetry on television. For Front Row, he spoke to me from his home in rural Lincolnshire, where he now lives. I asked him first how he was faring under the lockdown.
I've been okay, actually. I mean, I've got a lot to do. I'm a little bit emotionally kind of torn because I can't get to my mother, and that's a bit frustrating. And to be honest, I haven't really been out in the community that much. In my village, I've been probably talking more to the animals than the humans. So they're all right.
Excellent. Well, let's begin with a poem that speaks very much to this moment. It's about the human contact so many of us are missing, and it's called People Need People.
To walk to talk to cry and rely on, people will always need people. To love and to miss, to hug and to kiss, it's useful to have other people. To whom will you moan if you're all alone? It's so hard to share when no one is there. There's not much to do when there's no one but you. People will always need people. To please, to tease, to put you at ease, people will always need people. To make life appealing and give life some meaning, it's useful to have other people. If you need a change, to whom will you turn? If you need a lesson, from whom will you learn? If you need to play, then you'll know why I say, people will always need people. As girlfriends, as boyfriends, from Bombay to Ostend, people will always need people. To have friendly fights with and share tasty bites with, it's useful to have other people. People live in families, gangs, posses and packs. It seems we need company before we relax. So stop making enemies and let's face the facts. People will always need people, oh yeah. People will always need people, oh yeah.
Oh, thank you. Benjamin Zephaniah reading from his poem, People Need People. And we're going to talk more about the impact of COVID-19 later, but I'd like to go back to the beginning of your career and ask you a bit more about your route to becoming a performer. In a way, we take it for granted that you are one of our best known and most valued poets. But I find it remarkable that from a very young age, in a family where your father was violent, through the racism you met in Birmingham in the 60s growing up, your brushes with the law when police officers, Borstal guards told you were worthless, you always knew you were a poet. How did poetry first come to you?
I just loved words. You know, I study martial arts, and when you study martial arts, one of the things you really love, because it helps you get through it, and it's like at the root of every technique is breathing. So you say to people, you know, I love breathing, and they go, well, everybody loves breathing, you know, and everybody thinks that, you know, that they use words, but there's something very special about words that I think poets and creative people kind of latch onto, and it's very hard to describe, but I love the rhythm in words, I love the rhyme, so it was that really.
And the language at home, because your mother used to tell you amazing stories. Tell me a bit about her influence and her Caribbean background.
My mother would, she hates it when I say she's a poet, because you say that, you know, she's never written a poem in her life, but she was always kind of making up little rhymes if she wanted us to remember something. And then there was all these Anansi stories from the Caribbean. Anansi was a bit of a trickster. He was always getting himself into trouble, but he'd always find a way to work himself out of it. So there was always a little bit of wisdom behind them. So she was full of them. And then it also has to be said, the church. When most of especially the girls were looking at the singers and joining the choir, I was looking at the preacher. And I was looking at the way that he or she would use repetition. I was in church once. My mother was supposed to say something and she didn't have anything prepared. So she just said, oh, don't worry. My son's going to get up and read a poem for you. And I got up and I didn't actually read a poem. I just read the books of the Bible, but to a kind of reggae rhythm. And they thought I was a prophet. The preachers were really charismatic, and although they wouldn't admit it, they were kind of competition about who was the most charismatic preacher. When we were losing, they would say, yeah, bring out the big guns, bring out Benjamin, you know what I mean? Because a little 8-year-old kid that could preach and do poetry was like, it was quite unique.
Quite something to know so young that you had this power. You did, as you were growing up and becoming a teenager and into your early 20s, you were an artist in the kind of dub and reggae poetry scene in London in the early 1980s. You were warming up the crowds at Rock Against Racism gigs. You say in your memoir, I wanted to bring poetry to the dance hall. I'm fascinated about the formative influence of, those sound system parties, the music on your poetry, and indeed the whole art scene in London in the early 1980s, when people who weren't around then don't realise there were squats, all kinds of independent possibilities, weren't there?
When I was about 8 years old, I kind of made up my mind what I wanted to do, but I couldn't point to anybody else that was doing it. And then I kind of got lost. I went into a world of crime and just doing bad things, getting in trouble with the police, sometimes getting in trouble when I didn't do anything, and then sometimes, I was guilty. And then I thought to myself, I have to do something with my poetry. People kept telling me. You see, I would go into these dances and I would grab the microphone and just freestyle over these instrumental reggae songs. I performed in a few community centres around Birmingham. But when I went to the theatres, at that time, there's probably 3 theatres in Birmingham. They just didn't understand what I did and said there was no place for me. I mean, none of them were really rude, just kind of quietly racist. So I went to London. And it was just, the time was just right. It was like 1978. Rock Against Racism was kind of strong. The punk movement was strong. I didn't even call myself a political poet then. I just write about reality. To free Nelson Mandela and to get rid of apartheid and all those things. The SUS law, the law of suspicion that said if a police officer looked at you and you may do a crime in the near future, she or he had the right to arrest you, which just meant every black person looked suspicious to almost every copper. I remember once I got stopped 4 times in one night. So, there was a lot to kind of be angry about. So my poetry just kind of came at the right time. And a lot of my first performances were actually standing at the side of the stage at these Rock Against Racism gigs. And my name wasn't on the bill. And I'd just stand there and go, can I go on and do a poem in between the bands? And they would let me on. And it's hard for a lot of people to understand that reggae and punk was so close then. I mean, as musical styles, they are so different from each other. I mean, punk's going at 100 miles an hour. Reggae is going so slow, it's almost going backwards. And but what do we have in common? We were living on the same estates. We were being stopped by the police in the same manner. And the other thing was that the National Front hated us all. So we knew that there was kind of strength in unity.
Well, strength in unity is something that comes through so powerfully in your poems. Let's hear another from you. This is As a African from your 1990 collection, Inner Liverpool.
As an African, I danced the rhythms wild in Nicaragua. I overstood them well. As an African, I did not celebrate 200 years of Australia. I overstand its histories black. As an African, I went to find Palestine. I got confused on the West Bank, and as an African, Palestine is important. As an African, I grew old. I went and sat down with and reasoned with Mr. Ayatollah. Mr. Ayatollah told me if I mind my own business, and so did Mr. President USA. Mrs. Thatcher didn't even talk to me. As an African, a plastic bullet hit me in Northern Ireland, but my children overstood and they grew strong. As an African, I was a woman in a man's world, a man in a computer's world, a fly on the wall of China, a Rastafarian diplomat, a miner in Wales, a red-hot Eskimo, a peace-loving hippie, an honest newscaster, a city-dwelling peasant. I was an Arawak, an unwanted baby, a circumcised lady. I was all this and still a African.
Benjamin Zephaniah, thank you. This global connection, I'm fascinated by what inspired that internationalism in the way you view the world.
You see, when I was young, I can remember watching the television, and I'll never forget going to my mother one day and saying, "Mum, look at what's going on in Biafra. Why are these white people always hurting black people?" And my mother said, "No, son, this is black people hurting black people." And I went, "What? We do it to ourselves?" And so I just thought, even back then, I was only a small child, that I have to kind of speak up against it. It sounds crazy. But like I said, when I was 8 years old, I had this mission.
You use the word overstand instead of understand,
Yes.
and you use it many times in that collection. It seems to have a serious meaning as well as the playfulness of it. How do you see that word?
Well, the way I describe it when I do my gigs, I say, well, look, politicians say they understand you all the time, and then, they stand on you and you are understood because you're literally walked on. Overstanding is more empathy. It's a higher level of understanding. It's a real connection with you. In Jamaica, I can't speak about the other island, but in Jamaica, they have this thing about changing words all the time. Peter Tosh, who was, one of the original Wailers with Bob Marley, he was a master of it. Instead of saying oppressor, he said downpresser. They keep you down. Instead of saying official, it was high official. It's just taking the English language and just slightly tweaking it to kind of reinforce what we really mean. Because sometimes the word alone, as it stands, wouldn't convey the right meaning. And actually, even the word poet, if you take the word poet, we were so almost embarrassed to use it as a standalone word. We would have to say dub poet, reggae poet.
Why?
Because if you said poet, you always thought of a dead white man. We had to say something else to bring something else to the table.
You do play with the works of old white, sometimes dead male poets. In This Be the Worst, from your next collection, Too Black, Too Strong, you riff on Philip Larkin's very famous poem, This Be the Verse, famous for the line about how your parents will politely mess you up. How much do you enjoy having work in dialogue with other British poets?
The thing I love about Caribbean poetry and performance poetry is because it's kind of free verse. I mean, you can put it in a rhyming structure. It will always have a kind of rhythm, but it's got a kind of structure of its own. But I do love some of the old traditional forms of English poetry. When I was something like 10 years old, I wrote, "To free or not to free?" That was the question. And in that free it came to me, there is still rejection. I cannot help the way I feel. I try to put aside a flame of hope my language spoke, my culture could not hide. I love taking things that Shakespeare wrote or Shelley wrote and just kind of making them mine. I don't know if you read a poem of mine called What If? It's kind of riffing on Kipling. Yeah, because I do love these forms of poetry and I love rhyme.
Well, we actually have got a clip of you in conversation with some great British poets. In the 1992 film Dread Poet Society, you encountered some of the best-known writers of the Romantic period on a train to Cambridge.
I am Lord Byron, an English lord and the finest poet of the age. At your service. This is Percy Shelley, a scribbler of verse. His wife, Mary, a woman, and John Keats, a dwarf and an irksome source of misery to us all.
Actually, Lord, he's famous and everything. Look, he's got his picture in the paper, look.
This good-looking chap is Mr. Benjamin Obadiah Zephaniah. He is a poet. He is a poet. Mary, writing things. We'll soon see who are the poets around here.
Dread Poet Society starred Alex Jennings, who we heard there as Byron. It also starred Alan Cumming as Percy Shelley, Emma Fielding as Mary Shelley, Dexter Fletcher as Keats, and we heard Timothy Spall as a commuter. That film, which Benjamin, I've told you before, it's my favourite piece of television ever. I remember seeing it when it was broadcast on television. It has its roots in a real controversy. You had been offered a Cambridge University fellowship at Trinity College, but the tabloid press, and particularly the Sun newspaper, and this was 1987, whipped up a huge storm of controversy about you. Would you let this man near your daughter, was the headline. And how do you look back on that whole experience?
I mean, that headline, it was as if I was a rapist or something. At the time, there was a lot of politics going on behind the scene. There was a couple of newspapers, not only The Sun, some others, that said some nasty things. I felt kind of hurt, of course. Another thing that happened was that, I would wake up in the morning and there was press in my garden. Press followed me. They tried to trace old girlfriends of mine and stuff like this. So it was really difficult. But it was kind of representative of what was going on in the country. I mean, at the time, my poetry performances were filling big music venues. And then you had the mainstream media going, what is this? We don't understand it. I mean, people in universities were debating, does performance poetry have merit? Who are these poets, these Linton Kwesi Johnsons and Jean Breezes and Benjamin Zephaniahs?
We've come a long way since, though, haven't we? I mean, here you are, a professor at Brunel University. You're considered a very senior figure in British poetry. Your work is widely studied in schools. You came third in a BBC poll of the nation's favourite poet. But when it comes to honours, some prominent writers and artists of Caribbean and African heritage have said yes. You have always said no. I'm interested in why.
I don't write to impress monarchy or government. I'm quite anti them. And so I would just feel slightly dirty if I took something from them. This is not a personal attack on any politician or any member of the royal family, right? But the idea of me, somebody that's fought against empire all my life and wrote against it, who suffered under it and who has tangible connections in the Caribbean, shackles that my family were chained with, right now in my family's houses in Jamaica. For me to go and put the word empire, attach that to my name, I just couldn't live with myself.
It feels now that there's a renewed passion among all generations for discussing the crimes of empire and slavery and needing an honest reckoning with the past, which hasn't yet been done. And I wonder what you've made of protests more recently, such as the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at Oxford University, some of the campaigns in Bristol against Colston's name on the Colston Hall. He was, a notorious slave owner.
Well, back in the day, I refused to play in that hall myself. I supported the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, and still do. I think even people like Winston Churchill, I think he needs to be examined. It doesn't mean we've got to turn around and kind of wipe him out of history. We have to just try and be as honest as possible. No country, no human being is perfect. And we have to kind of examine ourselves all the time. And so there's nothing wrong with looking at some of our so-called heroes and saying, actually, on this, she or he got it wrong. I look at myself and I'm doing that all the time. So I don't know why we can't do it as a country. It's not kind of wiping out history. It's not, just revising history for the sake of it. It's just now we are able to be more honest with each other. We are more multicultural and we should be more open to kind of really true, honest intellectual debate.
But equally, you once said Britain is probably one of the only places that can take an angry, illiterate, uneducated, ex-hustler, rebellious Rastafarian and give him the opportunity to represent the country. Your words. This was referring to the touring that you'd done abroad with the British Council, which is, of course, widely respected around the world. You're kind of rather proud to represent the UK, aren't you?
Yes, because I think there are some things we do brilliantly. I mean, we do multiculturalism better than almost any country in the world. There's more intermarriage here. There's more intermingling generally. Our music is so creative because, the black kids hang out with the Asian kids who hang out with the white kids. And when we start playing our music together, we have all these different flavours. When it happens really naturally from the ground upwards, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, look how small we are, but how much influence we have culturally. And it's because we are multicultural. And a lot of people tend to think of multiculturalism today as kind of blacks and Asians. But actually, the Pits, the Sellers, the Juts, the Angles, the Saxons, all these tribes that came to Britain brought their own culture to make us who we are. And that's something I'm extremely proud of. But that has nothing to do with the government.
There are issues as well right now around the treatment of NHS staff, people of colour. And we're only beginning to grasp how seriously COVID-19 is having a far greater impact and a death toll among black and Asian people. There are many serious issues for a poet to be grappling with, aren't there?
Yes, there are. My mother is 86 now. She actually said to me on a phone call when they were calling for NHS workers and students to come back, she was saying, Benjamin, do you think I should go back? I think I should do my bit. I said, Mum, I don't think you should right now at your age. But that shows you the dedication of some people from...
Her instinct was to say yes.
Yes, yeah. But the interesting thing is, I think, that some of these kind of extreme racist people have just gone quiet because they find it so hard to kind of be racist and say, yeah, support the NHS. Because they much watch us and our parents and our kind of brothers and sisters dying on the front line. And so there is something to be said about people that come to this country, dedicate themselves to building this country and helping people and not really getting recognised for it. Now, let's be honest, right? A lot of the people I see now clapping for the NHS were just a few months ago saying that actually a lot of these workers should go home. I mean, they kind of literally voted against them. And so we have to really examine who we value in society, because most of the people that hold this country up are the low-paid workers, the people who are working on 0 hours, the nurses. So I don't know the reason for why so many people from ethnic minorities are being affected by COVID-19. The only thing I can say is similar to what other people have said, we tend to live in multi-generational houses and we tend to work on the front line, even in supermarkets. But I hope that the people of this country, black, white and Asian, all of us, when we get through this, look back and say, come on, we got to value each other more, regardless of what we do.
You have written a new poem celebrating the NHS. Would you read from it for us?
I've got to tell you, first of all, this is very exclusive. I am actually reading this from the paper because it's just been written, and I've got to credit it because it's for a new book by the doctor turned writer, Adam Kay, in praise of the NHS. And this poem is called Praise the Saviour. In Barbados, my grandfather, a twin, but his twin brother died at birth. My father, too, was a twin, but his twin brother died at birth. I am a twin, a difficult twin, and I almost died at birth. I was an emergency, born in a corridor of the hospital that my mother worked in. I never saw my father cry, but I am told that he cried when he saw me struggling to enter the world via Birmingham. I am told that he cried when he saw my mother struggling to give birth to this dub poet, the first of a set of twins already growing dreadlocks. But this was England, and I made it. 12 I was when they found a lump in my breast. But boys don't get breast cancer, my father said to the doctor. I thought I was going to die, but I made it. 15 I was when my lungs collapsed. An athlete with no lungs won't work. And I thought I was going to die, but I made it. 25 I was when my testicles blew up. I told my girlfriend it was a football injury, told macho lies to the guys, but I made it. 55 I was, when in the middle of a lecture, in front of my students, in between Homer and Ginsberg, my appendix burst. Pop! Yes, I thought I was going to die, but I made it. I went down the tunnel, I saw that light, and they brought me back. So I made it. I made it because someone had a dream of healthcare for all. I made it because someone said, this is for me and free. I made it because some idealistic rebel thought I deserved it. So when I think of why I'm here, I think of it. When I think of all my mother's work, I think of it. And when I go into that little room, I vote for it. I have loved it since the day I was born. The NHS is for life, not just for emergencies.
Benjamin Zephaniah reading Praise the Saviour, his poem for the NHS, which is going to be published in July in Dear NHS, 100 Stories to Say Thank You. Thank you so much for that. And it also made me think how you made a series of programmes for Radio 4 in 2019 about infertility, and you said you'd suspected from a young age that you wouldn't be able to have children, something doctors confirmed later. I hope you don't mind if I ask how that knowledge has shaped your work, because there's a huge generosity in your writing.
I think what happened was I was so political in the early days. And I always had this feeling that I couldn't have kids. And like you said, doctors confirmed it. I didn't go away and write lots of poems about infertility, but I just kind of got a lot more personal. And I think sometimes with political writers, it can be a difficult thing to do. There was a lot of anti-Thatcher poets and anti-apartheid poets, but And when apartheid went and Thatcher went, they had nothing to write about. And I kind of always thought that I need to dig deeper. So when those big issues were not resolved, but, when I was kind of getting older and having to think about other things and other issues and more personal issues, my writing just kind of opened. And that's why I'm still here, I think. Because there's lots of writers from that generation that they're not around anymore because they didn't have anything else to say.
I want to raise another question before we finish. The Ghanaian-born poet and critic Kwame Dawes once said that sometimes there's the impression that Benjamin Zephaniah is seen as harmless. Your rants against Britain allow Britain to declare its wonderful liberal sensibility. Do you worry about that?
Well, no, not really, because I think that I'm being true to myself when it comes to criticising Britain for whatever reason. I like to be fair. One of my favourite Jamaican poets is called Michael Smith. And he was stoned to death on the streets of Jamaica. At that time, if I was in Jamaica, I would have been stoned to death for the things that I said in Britain. I wasn't stoned to death in Britain. I travel all over the world. I spend a lot of time in China, in Cuba and places like this. I love those places. But if I was living there, being the poet I am now, I would be either in prison or dead. But on the other hand, if you talk to me about the police, a lot of people in this country say the police are nice. The police almost killed me. I have never forgiven them. Kwame Dawes has never had that feeling of being near to death in a police station in Britain. And, and I'll shout about that for the rest of my life. And I have friends who have joined the police force. So criticism where criticism is due, but praise where praise is due. If Britain was such a bad place, I would not be here. And if I felt that there was no hope, I would not be here. I'm here because I think there is hope, and I want to defend the people of this country, whatever kind of ethnic background they have. And I think that although I'm critical of the system here, I think we have the ability to change it. And that's why I'm here.
Benjamin Zephaniah, thank you. Thanks for listening to this special edition of Front Row. I'm Samira Ahmed and the producer was Simon Richardson.